these two brands are not often known that they are actually from the same stable, because back in 1924, two German brothers by the name of Adi, his real name was Adolf, but you can understand why he was called Adi, and his brother Rudolf started a trainer company selling shoes. And they had great success because these two brothers had the deal with Jesse Owens, who was the Olympic runner, you remember, and won the 1936 Olympics. And because of that, he was wearing their trainers. Their business absolutely exploded, and they had a lot of fame and success. But the two brothers ended up with friction between them. They lived in the same house with their families, so the business and the house was shared, and their two families lived together. And when the war started, it only seemed to exasperate their relationship. One time they went down into the bunker to get away from an air raid, and one insulted the bombers, but the brother thought he was insulting him, and those words started really the feud in earnest. Then Rudolf got called up into the army, and he ended up being taken as a prisoner of war and spent most of the war in a prison camp, while his brother Adi carried on the business and carried on making trainers. And of course, after the war, when you had all these American GIs there, they all wanted these trainers, and it was good business. And his brother came back, and there was a lot of bad blood between them, especially when it was later found out that Adi and his wife had Rudolf called up, conscripted, to get him out of the way because of this. And of course, he had been in prison for that. And so they parted company, and they both started their own trainer companies. Adi started his company, Adolf Dassler, that's his name. Adi Das, he's the gentleman close to me, and Rudolf Dassler started his company called Puma. And sad to say, the rift never healed all their lives. In fact, when they both died, they were buried in the same graveyard, but at opposite ends of the graveyard. And it didn't just affect them, it affected everybody in the town, because people worked for them. And so they had divided loyalty. And the people of the town were known as neck benders, because before you would talk to someone, you would look down and see what shoes they were wearing. That showed whose your allegiance was to that side. It just permeated their whole community. It's a very sad story. But it's not the only one like it, is it? There are many families that have been divided and had division. I tried to find a picture for this, but couldn't, and maybe it's just as well. But there's two brothers called Tasso Hagiev and Asen Hagiev from Bulgaria in Malka Ada, who have lived together for over 40 years with barbed wire down the middle of the house to keep each other apart. And these two brothers have had fallouts. They have taken each other to court to sue each other over 200 times, and as a result they don't have the money to move out of the house to get away from each other, so they live with barbed wire down the middle of the house. What a sad, sad way to live. And the world is full of broken families like this. In fact, if you go to Croatia on a holiday, you might want to go to the Museum of Broken Relationships. Can you believe there is such a museum? But they say it's a fascinating place to go, where in this museum you can find letters and documents relating to broken families. And you can see the part of the display is laid out like a broken love heart. You can see things like the axe that one marriage partner used to destroy all the furniture so his partner wouldn't have it after they divorced. And things like this. All sorts of sadness there. And they say when people come out of this museum, some come out in tears as it reminds them of their own broken relationships. But a lot of people come out with their families saying, we've got to make sure this never happens to us. And that is a good thing that comes out of it. Well, here in the book of Genesis, we have our own picture of a family under stress, and a family fallout is brewing between Abraham, then called Abram, and his nephew Lot. And this shouldn't surprise us that this is happening in the life of the patriarch, because this is the devil's quickest way to rob people of peace. And it is the quickest way that he has to absolutely ruin people's lives. You know, the Lord Jesus told us, didn't he, a house divided against itself will not stand. And the house of Abraham, if it fell into a giant feud, would not stand. And it would affect everything. You know, when you're in a family fallout, it affects your prayers as well, doesn't it? 1 Peter 3 reminds us that husbands are to treat their wives graciously so that their prayers will not be affected. You know, I can't come to church having an argument with Heather. It's actually very unfair because she knows that, and Sunday's always coming up on me. So she always wins. No, that's not true. But you know, it's a reality. I know I can't have God's blessing if there's division and fallout in our family. It robs the witness as well, doesn't it? And in this situation here, I'm always impressed how the writer of Genesis kept mentioning the fact that the Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. You know what that means? That means the neighbours were watching. That's what it means. The neighbours were watching. It's a very real situation that you've got going on here. The devil loves it when there's a family fallout. And so it's no surprise when we see this happening in Abraham's life. Yet what we have in this story is actually a word of encouragement and instruction about such a big and real life situation that affects so many of us. I want us to study this morning and see it under 3 headings. I want us to see the source of the problem for this family fallout, the solution of the problem, and the sequel to the problem. Because if you're not in a family fallout now, it may be, and I hope it isn't, but it may be that one day you will need to apply these things yourself or to give others spiritual guidance along these things. So first of all then, the source of the problem, which is in verses 5 to 7. I should say 5 to 7, not 1 to 7. And what we have here is a threefold cord of trouble. We have a threefold cord of relatives, room, and riches. We have too many relatives, not enough room, and a lot of riches. And that's a threefold cord for trouble, for tripping people up with, isn't it? We see the relatives problem in verse 5. It says, "Now Lot, who was moving about with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents." Now you might say, well, I don't see what the problem is there. Well, the problem is here we have a relative who shouldn't actually have been there. He should have been still back in the land of Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham was from. Back at the beginning of chapter 12, you'll notice the Lord had said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." So God told Abraham to leave his household, his father's household, which included his nephew, and to go to the land of what was going to be Canaan at that stage. But in verse 4 we read, "So Abraham left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him." And if you come to chapter 13, the beginning of this passage, chapter 13 verse 1, it says, "So Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him." It's like the chorus to a song, it keeps coming round. Lot is the relative who shouldn't really be there. And you know what, dear friends, that can be a recipe for problems in itself, can't it? I learned something really interesting in a book by David C.C. Watson, not the minister at York, David Watson, but a book by David C.C. Watson. And he said that the Chinese symbol for trouble is two ladies living together under the same roof. I thought, yeah, I just thought of the book of Genesis when I read that story. I thought about that. I thought about the book of Samuel and so many other instances. And there's often relatives who shouldn't be there. Perhaps a mother-in-law who's invaded the territory, or a father-in-law, or some other relative who's come to live. And that can put pressure in the home on the family. That's why actually in Genesis 2 verse 24, when God created marriage between Adam and Eve, he said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. It is right that couples leave home to set up a home on their own. But relatives are a part of this problem here. Then you have the problem of room in verse 6. It says, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great, and they were not able to stay together. The problem was there wasn't enough room for both companies. And space is an ever classic one, isn't it? You know, even if you're camping, you know, the biggest frictions you can have are keep your stuff over your side of the tent. And it's difficult when you've got to share room. Well, this was the space problem that they were having in the land of Canaan at that time, with Abraham and Lot being together. And then you had the problem of riches. Now, you say it's a nice problem to have, but riches are very often the cause of frustration, aren't they? Verse 7, and quarreling arose between Abraham's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot, because they brought back so much from Egypt that was of wealth and supply, that this meant their houses were overflowing. I think of the different newspaper stories I've got in my file of family feuds over all the wealth of a family and the riches. We could talk about that for hours, couldn't we? Well, dear friends, this is a recipe for disaster. It's a threefold cord that the devil can use to trip people up with. And these sort of things are the real concerns that make us set up for an upset in a family home. You have relatives who shouldn't be there. You have room you can't share. You have riches that require care and responsibility, and there's not enough space for it. It's a real problem. And as I said in verse 7, the neighbours are watching, which only increases the pressure, doesn't it? You know, I'm wondering if I'm talking to somebody today who's in such a difficulty. If the sound of my voice is in the ears of somebody who's facing something like this, well, I want to say, dear friend, you need to start praying about the problem right now. You're not doing anything about a problem until you're praying about it, and prayer is the first thing you need to do. You need to bring it to the Lord. Remember, James chapter 4 says, where do wars and quarrels come from? And he talks about the fact that we're clashing together, and he says you do not have because you do not ask God. And he says there, the solution begins with prayer. If you're in that situation, you need to be praying about it. But you need also to make decisions to fight the problem and not fight each other. You know, there's a verse in the book of Proverbs which is very applicable to this situation. It says, Proverbs 17:14, starting a quarrel is like breaching a dam, so drop the matter before a dispute breaks out. And that's the best advice anyone can give in these matters. Once toxic tongues start talking and complaining, that's when problems begin. And it was a case of that with Abraham and Lot. So we see a real situation that many people can relate to. If you've got that, then address it prayerfully and spiritually as quickly as you can. The longer you leave it, the more damage it's going to do. But then we see the solution to the problem in verses 8 to 13. And I love Abraham here because, as I said, Abraham says, I don't want to fight my family, I want to fight for my family. I'm going to attack the problem, not Lot. And he acts so graciously and wonderfully in this situation. And it's a real indication of the man who had been backslidden in chapter 12, having come back to a close walk again with the Lord. And in verse 8 we see, so Abraham said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Abraham deals with this problem with real spiritual maturity, and he chooses the spiritual high ground to fight from. He says, I'm not going to yell, I'm going to yield. I'm not going to yell, I'm going to yield. No yelling, verse 8, let's not have any quarreling between you and me. And he's going to yield, verse 9. He says, you choose the land that you want. You go one way and I'll go the other. Now, what a gracious thing for Abraham to do. Now, he was the one who was called to the promised land. He was the one who was the mature, older one in years, had the family rest his authority on him from his father down. He should have been the one who was given the right to choose. But no, he humbled himself and he said to Lot, no, you choose. You go one way and I'll go the other. That way we won't have any falling out between us, because we're brothers. We want to preserve the family. And what a mature thing this was. It's right out of the book of Romans, which teaches us in Romans 15 verses 1 to 3, we who are weak ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Each of us should please his neighbour for his good, to build him up. For even Christ did not please himself. But as it is written, and it quotes then Psalm 69 verse 9, the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me. That's a psalm reference which is prophetic of the cross. And what the Apostle Paul is saying here is that if you do this, you're living a crucified life as a Christian. You're crucifying your own flesh, your own desires, to suffer the weaker person and let them have their way for the sake of peace. And this is what Abraham did. It was the Christ-like way to go. It was also evidence of the heavenly wisdom. You know, James says this in James 3, 17 and 18. It says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven, or from above, as the King James says, is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, or yielding, as it says in some translations, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. And then it says this, peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. James 3, 17 and 18. That's what Abraham did. He sowed in peace and he reaped a harvest of righteousness for it. Now, this takes great character, and as somebody said, it takes great grace to show great grace. But that's what God gave Abraham for this situation. And especially it took great grace with someone like Lot, because Lot was far less spiritual and far more greedy than godly. And when Abraham made this offer to him, look what it says in verse 10. It says, Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt towards Zoar. And what he did was he lifted up his eyes and he scanned the land. He did a reconnaissance, a survey of the land. And he saw that the best bit of the land, as far as for cattle was, because it was well watered, and remember the Middle East is a very dry place, was where the cities of the plain are. Now you can see that this is a 3D map of where they were in Israel. And you can see they're in the hill countries where they are here on my side of the map. But then it goes down to the Dead Sea, and you have the plain around Jericho. The cities of the plain are there, including Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a story we've got coming up in chapter 19. And that's where Lot saw, oh, it looks good down there, and I'm going to choose to go down there. He was actually being very carnal, because as we're told here, it was like the garden of the Lord, and it was like Egypt. Now, what does that mean, the garden of the Lord? Well, it might be a reference to the Garden of Eden, of course, but according to Genesis, it looks like that garden was possibly in the area of Mesopotamia, where they had come from. So this reminded him of home. It reminded him of being at Ur of the Chaldees, where they had a very wealthy society. But it was also like Egypt, where they had just come from. And Egypt, of course, was by the Nile, and it was well watered. And both cities, both Ur of the Chaldees and Egypt, were worldly places, materialistic places, and very prosperous. And so Lot, with a carnal appetite, looked at that and said, yep, that's where I choose. He chose greedily the best for himself. Now, this isn't actually speaking very well of Lot. Richard Bewes, in his book, When God Surprises, says this: the contrast was not between a saint and a rogue, it was more subtle than that. Genesis 13 presents us with a contrast between the advanced believer and the man who was content with an easy life. And it's a subtle warning against low-level Christian living. Lot was a believer. 2 Peter chapter 2 tells us he was righteous Lot, and it vexed his soul the way the people lived down in Sodom and Gomorrah. So why he lived there, I don't know. But he was carnally drawn to it because it appealed to his fleshly appetite and his greed of things. But for Abraham, that must have been quite a challenge to swallow that down. That Lot said, I'm going to take the best of the land for myself. But nevertheless, Abraham did it, and Lot went there, and the problem was solved. Friends, each one of us, when we have a family problem, has a choice to either be a part of the problem or a part of the answer. And Abraham made the choice to be a part of the answer. You know, there's a great story that's told about a preacher by the name of Peter Cartwright. He was a Wild West preacher in the days of cowboys and Indians, and he was a Methodist circuit preacher. He used to go out, and in those days the Methodists weren't, forgive me, but they weren't woolly, liberal, backslidden doctrine like they seem to be now. They were strong and sound in America, and he was a preacher of the gospel, and he would hold evangelistic meetings in towns. And in one place he went to, he preached, and there were two men who were having a feud. And when he had his revival meeting, both the men came to the meeting. Now, fascinatingly, neither knew the other one was there in the crowd. And when he gave the altar call, if anyone wants to give their lives to Christ, these two men, amongst everyone else, came forward to give their lives to Christ. The Lord worked in their hearts, and it was a wonderful thing. And before he prayed, while these men were at the front weeping their tears for their sins, he went down to the first one and took his gun, and he went down to the second one at the other end of the church and took his gun. And then after he led them in prayer, he said, "Now, did you know each other were here?" And the whole room went quiet. These men who had a feud, they were gunslingers. They would normally have shot each other to bits. But they went and embraced each other and were reconciled in front of the church in Jesus Christ. What a work of grace that is. And do you know what? That's what the Lord wants in every situation where there's a feud against people of the same family, where there's division. So let's make sure we take to heart the instruction, Romans 14:19. Let's make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. the Lord give us the grace to be able to do that difficult thing. Now, and by the way, I have to say this just in passing, you might want to make a note in your Bible, Genesis 36, 6-7, because there you see Jacob and Esau copied Abraham's example in that. So it was a good example for the family to follow as well. Thirdly, and finally, I want you to see is the sequel to the problem. And the sequel to the problem is in verses 14 through to 18 at the end here. I don't know if you know much about, well, who doesn't know, about the first the moon landing. I'm talking to people who probably know more about it than me. But Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. They're two men who both came up through the ranks of the US Air Force, both very ambitious men, both excelled in their careers. And when they both came into the Space Academy, they were both excelling and doing very well, both equal in every way. Both given the great privilege of being on that first lunar landing in the lunar module that went down onto the moon's surface. But in that little lunar module, and this is the one thing everybody forgets and doesn't know about, is one of them had to give way to the other to be the first man to walk on the moon. I mean, it's obvious when you stop and think about it, but that decision should have been made by management beforehand. But those two men had to, and Buzz Aldrin yielded to Neil Armstrong to be the first man to walk on the moon. And so all the photos are, or most of the photos, are Neil Armstrong. And you know what? After the space mission, Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon, is the name everybody wants. He's the man who gets invited onto the radio and television shows. He's the man who gets given the awards. He's the man who gets book companies coming after him, asking him to write a book. He's the man who gets to meet all the famous people. And Buzz Aldrin just sinks into a depression. And it dogged him for years and years and years. He had a clinical depression. He had to have severe medication for it and everything. It actually led to him having an alcohol problem as well. Now, why do I say that? Why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because yielding to somebody, like Abraham yielded to Lot, doesn't automatically mean it's going to be easy to live with what's happened afterwards. Sometimes it can actually have an after effect that is very difficult for people to live with, and it needs God's grace to be able to cope with. But what I find here very encouraging in this story is that God comes to Abraham to comfort him in light of what he has just done. And just as we read back in verse 10, Lot looked up and saw the whole plain of the Jordan. In verse 14, the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had parted from him, lift up your eyes. Can you see the comparison there? He lifted up his eyes and looked with greed on the land. Now you lift up your eyes. And God says to him, from where you are, and look north and south, east and west, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. And God shows him a vision of the land that he and his family are going to inherit. And God reaffirms the promise that he had made in chapter 12 that he was going to give this land to his people. But he added a word, the word forever. Forever. Now I want to tell you, dear friends, you could solve the Middle East crisis if you believe the Bible and you believe that one word. God gave them that land forever. Theologians need to take notice of that. Forever is long after the kingdom of David and Solomon, when the kingdom on earth was at its biggest. And people say, oh, this was fulfilled in the days of Solomon. Forever means forever. And that's what God said he was giving to Abraham. And he was giving him not only the land, but the people to fill it as well. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. So Abraham is going to have a child. He is going to have a family. And this was a big thing as well, because Abraham might well have yielded to Lot coming along in the first place, thinking, well, I haven't got any children. Maybe God's going to do it through Lot, and it's be Lot, my nephew. No, God says it's going to be through your offspring. It's something he's going to have to make clearer as the time goes on, so that they are like the dust of the earth. If anyone could count the dust from your offspring, dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. And it's a beautiful sequel to the story. God tells Abraham, this is your reward for doing what is right. And we read in verse 18, so Abraham moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. And he went and settled in a place that was going to be absolutely a choice place and a very significant place for Abraham. He was going to settle at Hebron, which was going to be the place where he and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob were all going to be buried. It was going to be where the spies were going to come in to the promised land and see the Nephilim, the Anakim who were there in those days. But they would also have seen the graves of the three giants of the faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was going to be here that David's kingdom began for 7 years before he was crowned king in Jerusalem. And who knows for sure, but it might well have been here that a young lady who was expecting a baby went to see her auntie, who in her old age was expecting to be a mother too. A lady called Mary went to see Elizabeth in the hill country of Judea, and it was where the priests lived, and of course Zachariah was a priest. It may well have been at Hebron. So it was a very significant place in the future of his family and the faith of Abraham, where he built an altar to the Lord. And I just want you to see the sequel here to this. You know, sometimes when I've given way to things, you know, the devil comes and whispers in your ear, in my ear, you know what, you're going to regret this. You're going to regret this. And we hear the stories of people like Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. We think, well, you know, it doesn't always pay. It doesn't always pay. But God is able to give a blessed sequel to it if it's his will. And we can look to him for that. Do you remember the story in 1 Kings 3 of the two ladies who came to Solomon with their baby? One baby that was dead, one baby that was alive. And Solomon had to apply his wisdom to that situation and said about, take a sword, cut the baby in half. And the true mother said, no, don't do it, don't do it. Solomon said, that's the mother. She was the one who said, don't do it, let her have it. She was willing to yield. As a result, she got the baby. And this is a picture again of the blessing God gave in yielding. So it can be costly, but God in his grace can give a great sequel to it for the people of God. So let's take that lesson to heart as well as we follow on this story. You know, I began telling you about the boys who were divided over the trainers, Adidas and Puma. And you know, for years, their two companies were rival companies. Until 2009, the two managers said, you know what, this is stupid, this has got to end. And on World Peace Day that year, they said, all right, let's have a game of football together. And we'll play with mixed teams. So it's not our team against your team, we'll be mixed teams. And one manager was the goalkeeper and the other manager was the striker on a team. And the family was reconciled. And in the businesses, it came to an end. It's a lovely and happy ending to a painful story. Well, maybe your family's facing a feud, or maybe it isn't. I hope it isn't. But I'd like to close in prayer for us all, using the prayer of Charles Wesley from his hymn. It says this: Jesus, Lord, we look to thee. Let us in thy name agree. Show thyself the Prince of Peace. Bid all strife forever cease. Make us of one heart and mind, courteous full of pity, kind, lowly, meek in thought and word, altogether like the Lord. And God's people said, Amen.